The most significant things are always going to have the most weight. They're going to have the most consequence. They're going to have the most impact from their discussion. And so we have to really weigh these options. We have to look at what's important and say, is this really important? Do we really need this? Because ultimately, what I believe is that the only hill that we should be dying on is the hill that Christ died on. So one of the reasons that I started my YouTube channel, that I started to get into creating content, was because I wanted to address this topic. And I've created 11 episodes now. I've been kind of alluding to that topic, but I feel disingenuous sometimes because I haven't addressed this topic out in the open. And it's kind of weird when you are creating stuff and you don't get to have the full dialogue. I actually saw something by Chris Williamson, who I suggest you all go follow. He runs a podcast called Modern Wisdom. Pretty great podcast. I enjoy listening to it quite a bit. But he had said something along the lines of, you have to battle constantly this one-liner quote that's out of context, or risk looking like a fool, or you have to over-explain yourself and risk losing the audience. And so it's a weird thing that I've been trying to put together and trying to understand myself as I'm getting more used to creating content. And so what I thought I'd do is I'd take some time today to talk about this thing that I think is over everything else that I've been talking about. And I think it covers everything that I'm going to be talking about too. It's kind of this introductory lesson, not lesson, but introductory talk that is needed to understand what I'm coming from. And so with that is that conversation that I'm looking to have. And now I'm not talking about the great conversation, right? That's last episode. And I also have a new video set up, kind of, that I figured out, and so I'm not recording backwards this time like I did last time, so that's great too. But what I'm hoping to talk about today is, as you saw in the title, religion or psychology, right? This topic of, is our rational capacity for thought what actually gives us power and something that we should be reliant upon, or is it religion? Is it something that's greater than ourselves that we should be really putting our energy into trying to understand deeper? And truthfully, to give you a hint, I think it's both, because both play such an integral role in different places. But before I get into that, if you would love to like and subscribe the video, I'd appreciate it. It tells me that you're liking the content, that this was enjoyable for you to watch. And also hit the subscribe button if you're not subscribed, to keep following along on this journey to wherever it takes us, right? Hopefully to some place great. And so I'd love for you to join me on that journey. So with this conversation of religion or rationalism, I think that we have to understand where this conversation comes from. And so I'm no historian, right? My background is in psychology and I'm a therapist. And so that's not my background. So very briefly, I think that this conversation of rationalism or religion has really been prevalent in the dialogue since the Enlightenment period, where we had a lot of these rationalist thinkers who started to put a lot of emphasis on individual capacity rather than capacity given by God. And so this conversation really boils down to, what are we? And I think that a great person to look at for this rationalist psychological point of view would be John Locke. John Locke was a philosopher who really honed in on a lot of different topics, but really honed in on this when it got to the what are we, honed in on this psychologism that our brains, our consciousness is what's really real, and it's who we are. We're nothing apart really from our brain. And that has kind of continued to dominate the conversation in the secular world, right? Because when you go to the flip side, to the religious point of view, you get more of a Aquinian view, right, of the hylomorphic standpoint, of which hylomorphism is just matter and form. It's just Latin, I think. And so you get the hylomorphic matter and form view that we are substantial creatures that are not apart from one another, but we're integrated wholes, and we're all these integrated wholes. And part of that is our essence is crucial to that, which is our soul, our spirit is in us, right? And it really goes through the fourth dimension, which the fourth dimension is time. And so it goes through that, and it allows us to persist into eternity, which the religious individuals believe, right? Which Christians believe in particular. And I'm going to be talking from a Christian point of view because I am a Protestant Christian. And although I like to just say that I'm Christian, I don't really like the whole Protestant, but I'm Christian, and so I'm going to be talking from that point of view. But feel free to comment on your own beliefs on this topic, because I'd love to start a conversation of what other religions and beliefs think they are, because it's an important conversation. Because if we don't get that right, if we don't get the conversation of what we are correct, we're never going to know what we should do, because we don't know what we are. We're never going to know how we should act or what we should believe or anything like that. And so we have to get down this discussion of what are we, because that's been bothering our society, our Western civilization, for the last 300 years, 300 years, something like that. And so I think it's very important for us to discuss this and to get this down and to be open about this dialogue that we're trying to bring about. Because when I think we had this enlightenment, we reeled away from religion, because religion had dominated the perspective, and then there's a new perspective and we're not sure what to do with it. And so we reeled away from religion because they couldn't answer the questions being posed by the rationalists, by the psychologists. And then rooted in that rationalism is empiricism, right? You have to have proof. You have to be able to see what it is that you are trying to say is true about the world. And religion couldn't quite do that yet. They couldn't quite say, here's the dogma, here's the belief that we have that allows us to say these things. And they couldn't do that. And at least not as sufficient to the rationalists, which became a problem. And so secularism kind of reeled away hard from religion. And then what happened is secularism took over schools, and secularism did that. And now we learn about these secular points of view without the religion, right? We have separation of church and state. And so we're not learning about these two different sides. But the Christian religion in particular has been cooking up some things that I think are really great. And it's not new things, because as it says, as King Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, nothing is new under the sun. And so it's just rehashing this old dialogue, this old wisdom into the new conversation. And that's all anything ever is trying to understand things again and again for each generation. And so that's what we're doing here. So I guess we're not reinventing the wheel, but I wanted to have this conversation because I think it's important. I want to share with you a quote from Carl Jung, because I think that he really gets this debate down. He gets the need for the debate. He gets the essence of the debate down, and I think that he's really attuned to what is going to come and what is happening now. And so he was writing this in 1933. This is from Modern Man in Search of a Soul. So I'm just going to read this for you here. It's a bit long, so bear with me, but I think it's really great. There are too many persons to whom Freudian psychology is dearer than the Gospels, and to whom the Russian terror means more than civic virtue. And yet all these people are our brothers, and in each of us there is at least one voice which seconds them. For in the end there is a psychic life which embraces us all. And I think what he's saying there, and what I've been able to find about what he's saying there, is that what we all get the argument, right? Those who are on the religious perspective, have a religious perspective, a Christian's perspective, they get the argument, right? That, yeah, we have to see the world through our psychology, and that's absolutely vital. And I would say that yes, and we're not even doing that right currently. We're not really integrating the findings from psychology into our daily lives. And so that's very important. But what he says just a little further down in the next paragraph is that the unexpected result of this spiritual change is that an uglier face is put on the world. It becomes so ugly that no one can love it any longer. We cannot even love ourselves. And in the end, there is nothing in the outer world to draw us away from the reality of the life within. Here, no doubt, we have the true significance of the spiritual change. And so I think what we can learn from that is just that this idea of rationalism, this idea of psychologism, it puts an ugly face on us because what we do is we rely more on the psychology than the fundamental principles that were brought to us by Christ, right? Through who I think almost everybody can agree is at the very least a model person, a great model for what we ought to be, because he was loving, he was firm, he was authoritative, but yet he was the lamb, right? He was humble in his opinion. He was humble, and not in his opinion, he was humble in his giving of the truth, right? Which is what I believe. And so I think that that's important to understand that, yeah, we're no longer reading the Gospels, and we're no longer upholding the civic virtue, and what we actually think is great is activism, is marching in the street and tearing things down because we don't like them anymore. And I think that makes us ugly. That makes society ugly. And we don't love ugly things. I mean, people like pugs, but aside from that, they like beautiful things. They like things that bring us up, that they love the higher goods, right? And we don't get that with just a psychological point of view. And I think it's important that we understand too what is underneath that. Why does psychology not answer the question? And so when we get to why is this an issue of, why is the ugly, unloving modernity, why is it that way? We don't get an answer from the pure rationalism. We get another answer, I think, or another hint at least, from Jung here. It is, however, true that much of the evil in the world is due to the fact that man in general is hopelessly unconscious, as it is also true that with increasing insight we can combat this evil at its source in ourselves. And so by learning more about ourselves, what we do is we make the unconscious conscious. And I think that in part is what the rationalists were trying to do, but by focusing on the rationalism, they are only emphasizing the rationalism. And then there becomes this distortion of, we are rational at all times, and therefore our thoughts, our ideas about what we are completely valid at all times, no matter what, because it's the internal, and this is where we get the subjectivism, the internal subjectivity of the individual is what matters, because that's what we are. And that's not true, right? And here's where Jung is starting to get there. And I think a little bit more will tell us again why. But what is significant in psychic life is always below the horizon of consciousness. And when we speak of the spiritual problem of modern man, we are dealing with things that are barely visible, with the most intimate and fragile things, with bowers that open only in the night. And what he's alluding to there is his concept of the shadow. But always that is most significant is below the horizon, right? Especially in us. And that's the thing that we don't understand. And that's the thing, actually, that religion gives us. If we listen to the actual sermons on Sunday, right? If we go to church and we actually listen, that's what we're saying, is that we have this capacity in us to be evil, to make things ugly and desolate and destroy, right? I think that's very clear. Now, in modern America, we tend to live in this bubble, and that is in part due to a culture of safetyism, of course, and whatnot, and things that I've talked about, surely, like smartphones and nihilism. But we live in this bubble where we think that we don't have that capacity anymore, that we are enlightened above that. And that's not true. We still will always have that capacity, because that's something that is a part of our broken nature, right? And which is something that religion gets us. And so I want to say that a great book that will give you a better idea of what man is without psychology is this book called The Human Animal. And I'm going to link it down below. It's going to be an affiliate link, of course, but it's really great. It's by Eric Olson, philosopher, and it's personal identity without psychology. And so it gives a lot of different points of views and really gives a good counter argument to this psychologism of particularly John Locke, who really started this movement. What I think we need to do, what I think we can do, is build a bridge between psychology and religion. We have to build this bridge if we're going to continue to flourish, if we're going to continue going up once again in our culture, in our society. Because as you might have heard me speak, if not, go check out my discussion on, both Nietzsche and The Great Conversation, both 10 and 11 give great overviews, I think, of this outward expansion of our minds, of our being, and that really doesn't allow us to reach higher things because we're concerned with the out, and with the out we get exhausted. But I think we need to build this because we always have this perceptual spot, to bring in psychology. We have this orientation to always perceive what is significant. So, for example, I'm just looking at the camera because for me, that's the most significant thing that I can do, and speaking in the microphone, for me to reach my goal of making a podcast that's nested in my other goal of starting a conversation around great ideas and ideas that are central to flourishing. So that's another thing that's nested. So we have all these things that are nested in one another that I believe lead to a significant life, right? Or at least making my life more significant. And so we always have this in our spot, and our attention is always focused on what we think is significant. And what happens is that we move towards it. We always go to what we see as the best thing for us, right? And so if we have a belief somewhere in us that we hold to be unconscious, we're still moving towards that in some way. And so that might be a rational belief of maybe I'm unworthy, and so then we're going to act out things that someone who is unworthy of, let's say, love, we're going to act out those things according to that belief. Now that might be unconscious. That don't matter, because the most significant things, as Jung said, are below the horizon of consciousness. We are unaware of them. And what happens is that those unconscious things only come out in the night, only come out in darkness. And that can be spiritual darkness too. It can be the darkness of our hearts. And that's important to know, because then we can say, okay, how do I bring the light? And you can maybe see here where I'm going, because Christ is the light. He's the light to the darkness of our hearts. And we have to let him in through the faith that he is the Word, and that he was the Word, and that he ordered the universe, right? We have to have that in us. We have to believe that. And then he purifies our hearts, and he gets rid of that shadow, right? Oh, and there's a continual renewal, because it's always an ebb and flow in us, but we have to take that step. And so that bridge is very, very important. Let me get back to that. That bridge is very, very important, because there's been the Catholic doctrine of fides et ratio, right? That I believe was put forth by Pope John Paul II. And correct me if I'm wrong, please. But he talks about how we need faith and reason because we need the flourishing of the soul, right? And so I'm Protestant, right? Like I've said, I'm not Catholic and I'm not Orthodox, so that makes me Protestant. But this bridge can help fill the gaps of a lot of faith in people, right? When we can say that here's the point that you were reaching towards, and we can do that with psychology, because what I see the conversation being is the why and the how. Religion provides the why. Psychology alludes us to the how, right? It gives us insight into how the why is carried out and how we move the why forward, right? And how we move towards ends like perception. Perception's so crucial to what we do, and if we don't understand perception, we're going to be lost. And I think a lot of my motivation too comes in to get a little bit more personal is through a conversation I had with my grandfather once, who he had said, as I was going through my undergrad, I had a conversation with him, and he had said that psychology was from the devil, and that he thought that, and he really rejected this rationalism that I was at that time experimenting with and kind of believing it. And I think that it was at that point that I'm like, no, I am going to be like so enraptured in psychology and all these ideas. And through that, I started to, because of my background and a bit by the grace of God, I was able to put together these pieces, right? And say, okay, well, we have perception, and then we have Christ. It's like Christ is the model, and so Christ is the thing that we should perceive. The Christ is the thing that we should move towards, and so we should have Christ at the center of our perception. Okay, yeah. He should be at the center of our minds, because we can never attain what he was, because he was God himself, right? He was God, but I can move towards his humanity, right? Saying that he can do these things in the flesh. And wow, that's incredible. And so I can do that. And so really that conversation with my grandfather kind of calling me out, he wasn't calling me out, he was calling the ideas out. And I think that's really important in what we need to do, is we need to call ideas out and say, no, that's not quite true. What we can do with that is, we could get defensive, sure. We could say, oh, no, what are you doing? No, you're an idiot, which is kind of the initial point that I had. But then, as time went on, my heart became open to the idea that, actually, no, he's got a point. This rationalism is destructive. And that's what we kind of get to next, is why we have this conversation, why we need to build this, is because we flourish together. And what's the opposite of flourishing? Destruction, right? Destruction. We destroy ourselves when we are not doing the ultimate good, right? When we're not pointing ourselves to something that gets us to the best possible place, which in Christianity is eternity, which is the possibility for an everlasting life. And a life is something that is always moving towards something of the greatest good, right? That we perceive. And so if we perceive Christ as the giver of everlasting life and the model of humanity, we can move towards that, right? Forever in our souls, because our souls transcend that fourth dimension. And so how we build this bridge, I think, is the next piece that we have to try to understand. And how we build the bridge is by discussing the most significant things. And that does not, as you might imagine, that does not bode well with this subjectivism that comes from rationalism, this diversity of opinion, let's say. It doesn't bode well with it, because if everything has the possibility of being true, we can never have something significant. We're going to only have anxiety, we have ambiguous stimuli, and therefore we have destruction. And so we have to posit the most highest thing, the greatest good, the most significant thing. We have to posit those things. We have to have a discussion of what those are, right? Because I could cop out and I could just say, no, Christ is the most significant thing, and which I believe is true. But let's talk about why. Let's talk about why living a Christ-like life is so important and why making disciples is so important. Let's talk about that. And let's see if there's a point that I can improve. And because we can always add to the pile, right? And I want to think of these as like rocks that we carry along in our backpack when we're talking about the most significant things, because the most significant things are always going to have the most weight. They're going to have the most consequence. They're going to have the most impact from their discussion. And so we have to really weigh these options. We have to look at what's important and say, is this really important? Do we really need this? Because ultimately what I believe is that the only hill that we should be dying on is the hill that Christ died on, right? And we don't have to die on that hill actually, because he died for us. And so what we should do is we should reach to achieve that. And Carl Jung, again, right? Maybe you're getting tired of the Jung quotes, maybe you're not, I don't know. But Carl Jung again comes with a thing and that really resonates with me. But he says here, we Protestants must sooner or later face this question. Are we to understand the imitation of Christ in the sense that we should copy his life and, if I may use the expression, ape his stigmata, or in the deeper sense that we are to live our own proper lives as truly as he lived in all its implications? It is no easier matter to live a life that is modeled on Christ, but it is unspeakably harder to live one's own life as truly as Christ lived his. And then he goes on to talk about how we would be regarded as crazy and that we ourselves would be tortured and crucified because we would be living as true to ourselves and because, well, we are also so broken, right? But I think that fundamental question of, are we to live our lives according to Christ? What is our end, right? And I think that there's a bunch of different denominations that posit different beliefs, and I think that's great because he says here, and honestly I think this is my last Jung quote, but we'll play it by ear. Here he says, "Who are forgiven for their many sins? Those who have loved much." We are hopefully those who are loved and forgiven because we loved much. Right? We are loved by our Creator because we did not withhold it. And he says that, he continues to say, but I'm not going to quote it, that those who reached damnation are those who did not love. And to love their Creator, right? To love that which created them and to love the other creations of their Creator, right? That's the point that we need to reach. And we don't get that with psychology. We have the art of gratitude, right? We have that discussion. We have the discussion of empathy and what it is to love. But love, in a sense, transcends that, and it reaches our souls. It doesn't reach our psychology. I don't feel your love in my psychology. I don't feel it in my brain. I feel it in my heart. And it impacts my soul because it helps to cleanse it, right? And so our psychology can't be the only answer, but it is a how. Empathy is how we love. Our gratitude is how we show our appreciation for love. And so this bridge needs to be built, and we need to go through and take inventory. We need to sort things out and to say, what is the end? What is the greater end that we could achieve together through rationalism, through this, and to be clear, like the intellect, the capacity for rationality is what separates us from other animals. And it is a divine characteristic, right? But it's not all we are, and it's not infallible because we are only animals who are sometimes guided by our our fallible senses, right? We are guided by those. And so we can't have an intellect that's always infallible. And so that's where we have to trust on something that is infallible, which is the truth of God. And now when we posit truths of God, and this is very important, we must say very carefully, what is it that is true for us to discern, because we will never know the full truth. And it is also important that we continue to examine our own beliefs and to say, why am I believing such and such? Why am I believing this instead of that? And to come back to Jung, right? He says, and this is my last Hume quote, he says, I believe, too, that there must be Protestants against the Catholic Church and also Protestants against Protestantism, for the manifestations of the Spirit are truly wondrous and as varied as creation itself. And so and this helps me to understand a bit about the splintering that Nietzsche was talking about in Protestantism that I'm not going to get into here, but it helps me understand that a little bit more, and I hope to have a continued discussion about that. But what we really need to do is that we need to acknowledge first that both have good conceptions of what we are, right? We have to posit, though, the highest ideals. We have to posit those things that are going to reach the most flourishing for ourselves and society, and those in our families, obviously. We have to posit those that have reached flourishing forever, right? The most flourishing of our mind, body, and soul forever, right? For the longest period of time that we could imagine. That's the highest ideals that we should be concerning ourselves with. And we can all contribute to this conversation. It's not just philosophers and pastors and priests that contribute to this. They are well welcome to the conversation because we need to have their expertise. I need to have your expertise in this conversation if I'm going to try to work it out, if we're going to work it out together, right? And each of us are going to work it out in a different way. But the thing that we have to do is we have to sort of, and I'm going to be careful with this, we sort of have to allow within ourselves a renaissance of ideas, in which I love Nietzsche's conception of renaissance, which is having some ability and using it to create. And what are we creating here? We're creating the significance. We are creating meaning that lasts through time, forever, hopefully, right? And so we have to allow ourselves to use our ability to create the most meaning over the most amount of time. That's what we have to do. That's what this renaissance is inside of you, inside of me, inside of anybody you share this with, right? And dig into these ideas with. That's what this is. This isn't just me talking as some guy on YouTube, right? Or wherever I share this, right? This is impacting our lives forever, for eternity. Because again, I believe in the Christian doctrine that there is eternity, that there is forever, right? And that when we close our eyes, when we breathe our last breath, we don't just die, right? That we have a death, but we have one death, and then there is another death that we could endure, right? We could have the possibility for a second death, but I'm not going to get into that here because it's not a talk for revelation. It's not. I mean, it could be some motivation, but it's not the time for revelation. But I think what we should have to do with this, what you can do with this, is to try and understand who you are. Try to understand at what points you're not living into who you could be. But before that, you have to understand who you are. And do some digging, do some research, question yourself, right, on these things, on these facts. Because if you believe, right, hopefully I have some in here, are just on that psychological bend, right, are just saying, I am just a brain and a body. Hopefully you've stuck around this long, and that I can say, this is great, but you are much more than that. You are not just, you are. And let's talk about what that means and follow along, because brother, we are going to reach unimaginable heights together, hopefully, and that we are going to be able to help you and anybody else that you might know. We're going to help you achieve, hopefully, something that is the greatest for the longest, right? And so with that, if you've made it to the end, thank you, first off, for enduring that. But I hope that this is some motivation to start building bridges in your life, and build bridges by sharing the conversation. Share this with a friend. Get them motivated about the ideas that we're going to be discussing here. Start a group. Start, anything, really. But just start moving towards something more significant than yourself. Sometimes that's ideas. Sometimes that's doing, right? There's a whole host of things that we can do. But if we don't do something, we end up perishing, right? We end up just fading out of existence. And I don't want surely, to live a life that I just fade out of existence. Because that's not what I believe that we are created for. And so share this with someone. If you've also lasted this long, hit the subscribe button. That'd be phenomenal. And I hope to see you all next time. Thank you.